The story of a doctor rushing to an emergency surgery shook the world. Dr. Sarah Mitchell was caught running a red light while trying to save a critically ill patient. What happened in Judge Frank Caprio's courtroom that day made American judicial history. When a human life and rules collide on that fine line between justice and mercy, Judge Caprio's decision moved millions to tears. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and hit that subscribe button if this story touches your heart. Providence Municipal Court. Thursday morning, 10:15 a.m. Judge Frank Caprio was reviewing the day's files with his usual calm and attentive demeanor. In his 37-year career, he had seen thousands of cases, but the one he would encounter today would deeply affect him and make him question his understanding of justice. The courtroom had its usual mix of people: anxious defendants waiting for their cases, law students observing court proceedings for their classes, and a handful of regular spectators who enjoyed watching Judge Caprio's unique approach to justice. The morning had been routine so far. A few parking tickets, a speeding violation, a stop sign runner, nothing out of the ordinary for the Providence Municipal Court. Court Officer James Wilson, a 15-year veteran of the municipal court system, called the next case. Case number 42367. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, running a red light and speeding, he announced, his voice echoing through the wood-paneled courtroom. The courtroom door opened and a tired-looking woman in her early 40s entered. She was still wearing green surgical scrubs, indicating she had just come from the operating room. Her hair was hastily pulled back in a messy bun, and her face showed signs of intense work over long hours. Dark circles under her eyes suggested she hadn't slept much recently. She carried a small bag and several files in her hand, walking with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to making quick decisions in high-pressure situations. Dr. Sarah Mitchell was one of the most respected heart surgeons at Providence Mercy Hospital. She was particularly known for her success in pediatric heart surgeries, saving dozens of lives each year. She had published numerous papers in medical journals and had pioneered several innovative surgical techniques for congenital heart defects in children. In medical circles, she was something of a legend. However, today she came to court as an offender. Judge Caprio examined the file and looked up, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose. His kind eyes, which had seen every type of human story pass through his courtroom, studied the doctor carefully. Dr. Mitchell, it appears you were reported running a red light on Hope Street last Tuesday at 7:45 a.m. and driving 20 m above the speed limit. How do you respond to these charges? His voice was firm, but not unkind. Dr. Mitchell stood straight, facing Judge Caprio directly. Guilty, Your Honor, she said without hesitation. Her voice was clear and steady, a stark contrast to the nervous mumbling that Judge Caprio typically heard from defendants. Judge Caprio looked somewhat surprised. Most defendants tried to defend themselves or find an excuse, even when the evidence against them was clear. This direct admission was refreshing, but also intriguing. Would you like to speak, Dr. Mitchell? Can you tell us what happened? He asked, leaning forward slightly, genuinely interested in her story. I would like to explain. Yes, said Dr. Mitchell, her voice tired but determined. But first, I want to state that I don't regret the choice I made, and if faced with the same situation again, I would probably do the same thing. A slight murmur rose in the courtroom. Such boldness was unusual. Several spectators exchanged glances. This wasn't going to be a typical traffic case. Judge Caprio removed his glasses and looked at her attentively. Please continue. We're listening, he said, setting aside his pen to give her his full attention. That morning, I was at home, had just woken up. I had been on call the night before, but hadn't been needed, so I was looking forward to a relatively quiet morning. Dr. Mitchell began her story, her voice taking on the precise, measured tone of someone accustomed to delivering medical reports. At approximately 7:15 a.m., I received an emergency call from the hospital. A 5-year-old girl, Emma Wilson, was having a serious heart attack. Emma is a patient with congenital heart disease, specifically hypoplastic left heart syndrome. She had undergone 2 of the 3 surgeries required for her condition, and we were monitoring her closely before the final procedure. Dr. Mitchell paused, organizing her thoughts. Her condition that morning was critical and required immediate surgery. The on-call surgeon had been in another emergency procedure all night and wasn't available. I was called because there was no other specialist surgeon at Providence Mercy that day who could perform this type of complex pediatric cardiac surgery. Judge Caprio nodded understandingly. The courtroom had now completely quieted down, everyone listening intently to the doctor's account. In cardiac surgery, especially pediatric cases, timing is absolutely vital. Every minute can be the difference between life and death, between full recovery and permanent damage. Children's hearts are particularly vulnerable to prolonged oxygen deprivation. Dr. Mitchell's professional demeanor softened slightly as she spoke about her young patients. When they called from the hospital saying, "Emma's condition is deteriorating. Her heart functions are weakening," I rushed out of my house. I didn't even take time to change out of my pajamas. I threw on a coat and ran to my car. Normally, it takes me 15 minutes to get to the hospital, but that morning traffic was unusually heavy due to a water main break on Elmgrove Avenue, which had diverted traffic onto Hope Street. Dr. Mitchell took a sip from the water cup provided to her, her hand showing the slightest tremor, perhaps from exhaustion, perhaps from reliving the stress of that morning. When I reached Hope Street, the light at the intersection with 4th Street was red and traffic was completely stopped. There were about 8 cars ahead of me, and the light had just turned red. I looked around at the surrounding vehicles, honked, waved through the window, but they couldn't move. They were boxed in. Dr. Mitchell's voice began to tremble slightly. My phone rang. It was Dr. Reynolds from the emergency room. "Sarah, where are you? Emma's oxygen levels are dropping. Her cardiac enzymes are through the roof. We need to get her on bypass in the next 20 minutes, or we're going to lose her," he said. I could hear the monitor alarms beeping in the background and the panic in his voice. Dr. Mitchell closed her eyes for a moment, as if reliving that critical decision point. That's when I made my decision. I looked over my shoulder, checked all my mirrors, verified there were no cars coming behind me, no pedestrians crossing. I carefully proceeded through the right shoulder and ran the red light. Once through the intersection, I increased my speed to get to the hospital as quickly and safely as possible. She opened her eyes and looked directly at Judge Caprio. I arrived at the hospital at 7:32 a.m., scrubbed in immediately, and we had Emma on cardiopulmonary bypass by 7:48 a.m. The surgery lasted 4.5 hours. We found a clot that had formed near her previous surgical site, and we were able to remove it and repair the damage before her heart sustained permanent injury. There was now complete silence in the courtroom. Several spectators seemed visibly moved by the story. Mitchell reached into her bag and took out a glossy 5x7 photograph which she handed to the court officer, who passed it to Judge Caprio. "This is Emma. We took this photo 4 days after the surgery. She's now at home recovering with her family. If I had been 10 to 15 minutes later that day, Emma's heart could have suffered irreversible damage. She might not have survived." Judge Caprio looked at the photo. A little girl with long blonde hair and bright blue eyes was lying in a hospital bed with a huge smile on her face. She was holding a teddy bear wearing surgical scrubs, and a rainbow of get-well cards decorated the wall behind her. "I see," said Judge Caprio, his expression thoughtful as he handed the photo back. "Officer Sullivan, is the officer present?" A uniformed police officer stood up from the back of the courtroom where several officers were waiting to testify in various cases. Officer Michael Sullivan was a 12-year veteran of the Providence Police Department, known for his fair but strict enforcement of traffic laws. "Yes, Your Honor," said Officer Sullivan, approaching the front of the courtroom. "Officer Sullivan, can you share your observations when you stopped Dr. Mitchell?" Judge Caprio asked. "Of course, Your Honor." Officer Sullivan stood at parade rest, hands clasped behind his back. "I was on patrol duty on Hope Street that morning. Traffic was heavier than usual due to the water main break on Elmgrove. At approximately 7:22 a.m., I observed Dr. Mitchell's vehicle, a silver Honda Accord, move on to the right shoulder and proceed through a red light at the intersection with 4th Street. After clearing the intersection, the vehicle accelerated to approximately 52 miles per hour in a 30 miles per hour zone. Officer Sullivan continued. I activated my lights and pursued the vehicle, which pulled over promptly once I was behind it. When I approached, Dr. Mitchell immediately identified herself and stated she was a surgeon at Providence Mercy Hospital. She explained she was responding to a critical emergency involving a child with heart failure. And how was her demeanor during this interaction? Asked Judge Caprio. Extremely professional and respectful, Your Honor. Despite being obviously in a hurry, she was calm, provided all requested documentation immediately, and explained the situation clearly. She made no attempt to evade the ticket or use her position to influence me. She acknowledged what she had done and accepted the citation. After I wrote the ticket, I offered to escort her to the hospital, but she said she was only 2 blocks away at that point and thanked me for the offer. Thank you, Officer Sullivan, said Judge Caprio. Then he turned back to Dr. Mitchell, his brow furrowed in thought. Dr. Mitchell, one last question. As a medical professional, you're well aware of the risks associated with traffic violations. Speeding and running red lights are leading causes of accidents, many of which result in injuries and fatalities that doctors like yourself must treat. How do you reconcile your decision that morning with the potential risks it posed to others on the road? It was a challenging question, addressing the central ethical dilemma of the case. Dr. Mitchell took a deep breath before responding. That's a question I've asked myself many times since that morning, Your Honor. I take road safety extremely seriously. In my practice, I've treated children injured in car accidents, and I'm acutely aware of the devastating consequences that can result from reckless driving. She continued, her voice steady. I made my decision that morning based on a careful assessment of multiple factors. First, I verified that there was no cross traffic coming through the intersection. Second, visibility was excellent. It was clear and bright that morning. Third, there were no pedestrians in the area. Fourth, I used my hazard lights to signal an emergency. And finally, I proceeded through the intersection at reduced speed, only accelerating once I was sure the way was clear. Dr. Mitchell paused briefly. I believe I took every reasonable precaution to minimize risk while responding to a life-threatening emergency. I've spent my entire career making split-second decisions that balanced different types of risks. That morning, I determined that the immediate risk to Emma's life outweighed the potential risk of my careful violation of traffic rules. She looked directly at Judge Caprio. In 20 years of driving, I've never received a traffic ticket until now. I don't make a habit of breaking traffic laws, but as a doctor, my first oath is to do no harm and save lives. That morning, I believed and still believe that the greater harm would have been failing to reach Emma in time. Judge Caprio remained silent for a while, fingers steepled in front of him, seemingly lost in thought. Everyone in the courtroom was waiting for his decision. The case had transformed from a routine traffic violation into a profound ethical dilemma about rules, responsibilities, and the value of human life. Finally, Judge Caprio spoke. Dr. Mitchell. Traffic rules exist to maintain order and safety in society. Breaking these rules generally results in punitive consequences, and rightfully so. Without adherence to traffic laws, our roads would be chaotic and dangerous. Dr. Mitchell listened attentively, slightly bowing her head in acknowledgement of the judge's words. However, continued Judge Caprio, his voice taking on a more philosophical tone, in my nearly 4 decades on the bench, I've come to believe that justice sometimes requires looking beyond the strict application of rules to consider the unique circumstances and moral dimensions of each case. Judge Caprio rose from his seat, an unusual move that immediately captured everyone's attention. He descended from the bench and walked through the courtroom, approaching Dr. Mitchell. This departure from standard procedure sent a ripple of anticipation through the gallery. Dr. Mitchell, in your case, we have a fascinating intersection of competing duties. On one hand, as a citizen, you had the obligation to obey traffic rules designed to protect public safety. On the other hand, as a physician, you had a professional and moral responsibility to respond to a life-threatening emergency involving a child under your care. Judge Caprio now stood directly in front of Dr. Mitchell, looking her in the eye. When these two duties came into conflict that morning, you made a choice. You chose to prioritize your responsibility to your patient, while taking reasonable precautions to minimize the risk associated with breaking traffic rules. The judge paced slightly, addressing not just Dr. Mitchell now, but the entire courtroom. This court is obligated to ensure justice rather than merely enforce the letter of the law. And sometimes justice, as you demonstrated that morning, requires prioritizing human values and professional ethics in complex situations. The courtroom was completely silent. Everyone was watching Judge Caprio with bated breath. His handling of this case was becoming one of those rare teaching moments that transcend the routine business of a municipal court. Therefore, after careful consideration of all the facts presented today, I've reached my decision. Judge Caprio turned directly to Dr. Mitchell. I'm dismissing your case, Dr. Mitchell. Your fine is cancelled. Spontaneous applause erupted in the courtroom. Some spectators couldn't control their emotions and burst into tears. A few of the law students frantically scribbled notes, recognizing they were witnessing an unusual application of judicial discretion. Dr. Mitchell looked at Judge Caprio with surprise and profound gratitude. But Judge Caprio wasn't finished speaking yet. He raised his hand for silence, and the courtroom quickly quieted down. There's one more thing, Dr. Mitchell. Judge Caprio's voice had softened. This court wants to thank you for your service to our community, especially for saving Emma's life. In a world that often seems increasingly self-centered, your dedication to your patient and your willingness to accept personal risk and consequences to fulfill your professional duty is admirable. Judge Caprio extended his hand to Dr. Mitchell. Our community needs doctors like you. Thank you for your humanity, your courage, and your commitment to the well-being of our children. Dr. Mitchell, typically composed and professional, couldn't hold back her tears as she shook Judge Caprio's hand. Thank you, Your Honor. I am deeply grateful for your understanding and wisdom. Everyone in the courtroom stood up and applauded for a long time. This was beyond just a traffic case. It was a celebration of humanity, compassion, and the thoughtful application of justice that considered the complex moral dimensions of human behavior. After the case closed and Judge Caprio returned to the bench to call the next case, something unexpected happened. From the back of the courtroom, a small commotion arose as a couple, a woman and a man, approached the gallery gate, trying to get Dr. Mitchell's attention. The woman was carrying a small girl with familiar blonde hair. Dr. Mitchell, called the woman, her voice trembling with emotion. Emma and we wanted to be here today. Dr. Mitchell turned to them in surprise, her hand going to her mouth. Emma's parents, Jennifer and Robert Wilson, had brought their little girl to the courthouse. They hadn't told Dr. Mitchell they would be coming. When Emma saw Dr. Mitchell, a huge smile appeared on her face, the same smile captured in the photograph. Dr. Sarah! Shouted the little girl, breaking free from her mother's arms and running to Dr. Mitchell, who knelt down to receive her. The doctor picked up the little girl, tears streaming freely down her face. Now, are you okay, sweetheart? Asked Dr. Mitchell, examining Emma with the instinctive assessment of a physician. Emma nodded enthusiastically. I'm fine. Mom said you got in trouble because you were coming to fix my heart. But you're my superhero. Superheroes shouldn't get in trouble for saving people. The courtroom, which had begun to settle down for the next case, erupted in laughter and renewed applause. Judge Caprio, who had been about to call the next case, set his papers down and watched the scene unfold with a warm smile. Emma's father stepped forward, emotion evident in his voice. When we heard about the court hearing today, we wanted to come right away. Dr. Mitchell, you saved our daughter's life. We will never forget this. Emma had been waiting for her final surgery, but when the clot formed, if you hadn't gotten there when you did. His voice broke, unable to complete the sentence. Jennifer Wilson took over. We've been told by 3 different doctors that if the surgery had been delayed even 15 more minutes, Emma's heart would have sustained irreversible damage. She might not have survived or might have needed a heart transplant. Dr. Mitchell didn't just save her life, she saved her future. Judge Caprio was watching this emotional moment from the bench. He raised his voice to address the courtroom once more. "I think we all learned an important lesson today," he said, his words carrying through the suddenly quiet room. "Justice is sometimes not just about following rules, but also about understanding the complex moral dimensions of human behavior and respecting the highest human values, including the sacred value of a child's life." Dr. Mitchell, still holding Emma in her arms, turned to Judge Caprio. "I will never forget this case, Your Honor. And neither will Emma." Judge Caprio smiled warmly. "Neither will I, Doctor. This has been one of the most meaningful cases in my career. It reminds us all that behind every case number, there are real human beings with real lives at stake." To everyone's surprise and delight, Emma wiggled out of Dr. Mitchell's arms and ran toward Judge Caprio's bench. Before court officers could intervene, the little girl had scrambled up the steps to the bench and thrown her arms around the startled but pleased judge. The courtroom erupted in laughter and applause once again as Judge Caprio gently returned the hug. "Thank you for not being mad at Dr. Sarah," Emma said loudly. "She fixed my special he." After the defense concluded, Judge Caprio leaned back in his chair and sighed softly. The entire courtroom was silent. "Officer Sullivan," he said finally, turning toward the police officer, "did you have any further comments?" Officer Sullivan cleared his throat. "Yes, Your Honor." After pulling Dr. Mitchell over, she immediately exited her vehicle and explained the situation to me. She appeared extremely distressed and repeatedly said there was a child waiting for her at the hospital who wouldn't survive without her. I verified her hospital ID badge, which she showed me, and I could see she was wearing surgical scrubs under her coat. She pleaded for me to let her go, but I informed her I was required to report the violation. However, I didn't delay her further. I took down her plate number and told her she could go. She drove away within seconds. He paused, then added quietly, "Later that afternoon, when I saw the hospital's press release about a successful emergency pediatric surgery, I realized it must have been the same child she mentioned." The judge nodded slowly. His eyes softened. "Thank you, Officer Sullivan. You may be seated." He then turned back to Dr. Mitchell. "Doctor, I've presided over this court for many years. I've seen people come here with every excuse imaginable: traffic, work, family emergencies, and sometimes even made-up stories. But your case is unlike anything I've ever encountered." Dr. Mitchell remained silent, standing respectfully, hands folded in front of her. "You see," continued Judge Caprio, "the law doesn't usually consider individual intentions when a violation occurs. The traffic light doesn't care if you're late for work, or if you're having a bad morning. It's there to ensure safety and order. Yet sometimes, humanity, the reason behind the action, forces us to question the balance between justice and compassion." He paused. The entire courtroom was focused on every word. "I have no doubt that your decision that morning was made with complete awareness of the risks, not for yourself, but for the life of a child. You prioritized another human being's survival over your own convenience. That's not negligence. That's courage guided by conscience." A few people in the audience nodded silently. Some were even wiping away tears. Judge Caprio continued, his voice now firm but filled with warmth. "Technically, by law, running a red light and speeding are violations. The penalty would normally total around $450 plus court fees. But Dr. Mitchell, I believe justice isn't just about punishing wrongdoing, it's also about recognizing righteousness when it reveals itself." He leaned forward, folding his hands together. "In this courtroom, we deal not only with the letter of the law but with its spirit. And in your case, the spirit of the law bends toward mercy, because your actions, while technically unlawful, upheld the highest principle of humanity, the preservation of life." There was a soft murmur of agreement among the spectators. Judge Caprio smiled faintly. "Therefore, I'm dismissing all charges against you. No fines, no penalties, no record of violation. However," he paused, looking at her kindly, I would ask one favor from you. Dr. Mitchell's eyebrows lifted slightly. Anything, Your Honor. When you next see young Emma, tell her this court sends her all the love in the world. And that sometimes angels don't come with wings, they wear scrubs instead. A wave of emotion swept through the courtroom. Applause broke out despite the formality of the setting. Even Officer Sullivan smiled broadly. Dr. Mitchell, visibly moved, placed a hand on her chest and said softly, "Thank you, Your Honor. I'll never forget this." Judge Caprio nodded. "Neither will we, Doctor. Neither will we." She turned to leave, and as she reached the door, the courtroom once again filled with applause. Even those waiting for their own hearings stood up in respect. As the doors of the courtroom closed behind Dr. Sarah Mitchell, Judge Caprio sat back in his chair for a long moment, his eyes distant in thought. The hum of quiet conversation slowly returned to the room, but his mind was elsewhere. He finally looked up and said softly, almost to himself, "Sometimes the law needs to look up from the page and see the person standing before it." Those who were present that day would later describe the hearing as one of the most moving moments ever witnessed in a courtroom. It wasn't about winning or losing, guilt or innocence, it was about understanding. News of the case quickly spread beyond Providence. Local newspapers ran the story under headlines like, "Judge dismisses case against hero doctor," and "When justice meets humanity." Television stations replayed the courtroom footage, and within hours, social media was filled with comments from people around the world praising both the doctor and the judge. Some wrote, "That doctor saved a life and reminded us what real duty looks like." Others said, "Judge Caprio didn't just serve justice, he honored it." A week later, Dr. Mitchell returned to the hospital after a brief rest. When she entered the pediatric ward, little Emma was sitting up in bed, coloring a picture of a heart surrounded by rainbows. When she saw the doctor, she smiled and said, "Mommy says you're my hero." Dr. Mitchell knelt beside her and said, "No, Emma, you are the hero. You fought hard. I just helped a little." Emma giggled and handed her the drawing. "Then you can keep my rainbow, so you don't forget me." Dr. Mitchell took the paper, folded it carefully, and slipped it into her coat pocket, the same pocket she had worn the morning she ran that red light. Weeks later, Judge Caprio received a small envelope at his office. Inside was Emma's rainbow drawing and a handwritten note. "Dear Judge, thank you for understanding my doctor. I'm alive because she didn't wait for the light to turn green. Emma Wilson, age 5." When Judge Caprio read those words, he smiled quietly. He placed the drawing in a frame on his desk, next to his gavel, a reminder that the truest form of justice is not always found in laws, but in the hearts of those who interpret them. In a world where rules keep us safe, sometimes compassion keeps us human. Dr. Sarah Mitchell broke the law that morning, but she did it to save a life. And Judge Caprio proved once again that real justice is not blind, it sees with empathy. Drop in the comments if you believe humanity should always come before punishment. And don't forget to subscribe for more real stories where compassion meets the law.